Welcome to my first ever podcast, and thank you to my daughter Nava for encouraging me to do this. I've named this podcast Aardenhout Times in honour of my late father, Joe Revelk. My father was born in Aardenhout in the Netherlands on the edge of the tulip fields between Haarlem and The Hague. At a time when polarisation has become so extreme and so dangerous that political murder is celebrated by some and used by others to further inflame hatred, it is time to stop, take a breath, change course before it's too late, and instead focus on what unites us. Accordingly, the topic for this first episode of my podcast is a generation of peace. Independent India's first Prime Minister, Nehru, famously said, "What we need is a generation of peace." With the end of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the USA and their respective blocs, with the collapse of the infamous, repressive, deadly Berlin Wall in 1989, world peace seemed tantalisingly close. But now, sadly, it feels agonisingly far away. So what can we do about it? You and I. Do we just despair and complain about the crazy state of the world? Do we make things worse, add to the misery by ourselves inflaming racial and political hatred and war between men and women, different cultures and nations and diverse religions? If we spread hatred in the streets and on social media against others, Jews, Christians, atheists, agnostics, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, people with different racial or national ancestry from us, then we are part of the problem, not the solution. Past injustices by people from any race, nation or religion do not justify hatred, division, polarisation and cancellation today. The genocide in Rwanda in 1994 started with hate speech, with just one radio station spewing out hatred against the Tutsis, calling them cockroaches who should be exterminated. It led literally to blood in the streets. Do we want that in the nations and communities in which we live? How will mouthing off on Facebook, YouTube, or some sinister corner of the internet about Jewish people, Muslims, Africans, Europeans, Hindus, Buddhists, this political party or that political party, etc., how will that help? Instead, we can focus on building peace globally and in our own communities. We can make new friends from other cultures, races and religions, swap notes and build bridges of peace instead of walls of polarisation. We can refuse to be overwhelmed by doom and not buy into poisonous philosophies and extremist political movements which pour petrol on the flames of racial, national, political and religious differences. We can remember a time in history when there was hope and rapid, undreamt of progress. That is 1989. And then a decade of unprecedented cooperation, along with some terrible crimes, but followed by accountability in international criminal tribunals, the 1990s. The collapse of the Berlin Wall seemed an impossible dream at the time. No one predicted the collapse of the Soviet Union. But it suddenly became a reality. That is when there could have been a generation of peace. Before it's too late, we need to get back to the hope symbolised by 1989, that famous year. To do that, let's first survey the progress that was made, and next, how it all went wrong, with nationalism, bigotry, fanaticism, and terrorism dragging humanity to the edge of the abyss again. And finally, what can we do to get back on track on what singer Cat Stevens called the peace train? This episode will be divided up into the following sections. First of all, progress in international law. Next, international law and the responsibility to protect. Followed by, where did it all go wrong? After that, the triumphs of international criminal tribunals. Next, collective security does work. Next, what happens when we give up on collective security and international tribunals? Followed by learning from Gorbachev and Reagan, Gorby and Ronnie. Next, why we can establish peace. Followed by reforming the UN, and then the conclusion. So, progress in international law. Let's start with the progress and opportunities for international law to flourish in our daily, ever more interconnected world. Australian philosopher Peter Singer neatly described the world we are living in and the urgent need for enforceable international law to counter the rise of global lawlessness, as evidenced by the multiple wars raging right now. This is what Singer said: the 20th century's conquest of space made it possible for a human being to look at our planet from a point not on it and to see it literally as one world. Now the 21st century faces the task of developing a suitable form of government for that single world. In other words, a world governed by international law. As President John F. Kennedy famously declared to the UN in 1961, we prefer world law in the age of self-determination to world war in the age of mass extermination. That is just as true in 2025 as it was in 1961. In fact, the need is even more urgent today, given global tensions, the rise of spiritually bankrupt religious fanatics, and military inventions such as hypersonic missiles, stealth bombers, and killer drones. We need world law more than ever. The foundation stone for global governance was laid with the establishment of the League of Nations and the Permanent Court of International Justice after the futile horrors of World War I, where millions were mown down in muddy, rat-infested trenches and left to die, trapped in barbed wire in no man's land. Never again was the cry. World War I was supposed to be the war to end all wars. Disputes were to be settled in courts rather than on battlefields. Just like we do within nations, we don't murder our neighbours over a fence dispute. If we can't negotiate a solution, we go to court instead of firing missiles. That is common sense. It's logical. It need be no different for international disputes. It's only because of humanity's immaturity and determination to learn everything the hard way that war and terrorism are still used as political tools. The League of Nations was a tentative start. In the end, it failed, but the very fact that it was created for the first time in history was historic. Further advances in peace through law were made with the creation of the United Nations, the UN, and its judicial arm, the International Court of Justice, the ICJ, after World War II. However, rapid progress in global governance only occurred after the end of the Cold War in 1989. The advances included the end of more than 40 years of paralysis in the United Nations Security Council, the UNSC, when the US and the Soviet Union, often along with China, were on opposite sides of just about every issue. For example, the genocide of Pol Pot in the killing fields of Cambodia. What possible national interest could justify supporting Pol Pot? But this changed in 1989, thankfully, and for a short period after the end of the Cold War, international law blossomed. The newfound unity was demonstrated by, amongst many other actions, Security Council approval of the US-led action in 1991 to evict Saddam Hussein's Iraqi forces, which had invaded and annexed Kuwait. Growing acceptance of humanitarian interventions to stop genocide, for example, in the former Yugoslavia, and the establishment of international criminal tribunals such as the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the ICTY, and the International Criminal Court, the ICC, by the Rome Treaty, which Australia is a member of. The strong, unanimous UN Security Council response to the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the US offered further hope for the continuing evolution of global cooperation and governance. It's important to remember that this was unanimous. Russia, China, the US, France, England, and all the other members who are not permanent members agreed. This was a major milestone. However, the aspiration of terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and ISIS and others to acquire and unleash weapons of mass destruction, that is WMD, injects urgency into the debate about adopting much more muscular global cooperation. As the Canadian academic and former politician Michael Ignatieff said, global governance in these areas, that is transnational crime, think of, for example, international child abuse rings or international drug trafficking. This sort of thing can't be controlled by one nation state alone. It needs global cooperation. But back to his quote. Global governance in these areas, transnational crime, especially terrorists pursuing WMD, has ceased to be simply desirable. It has become a matter of mutual survival. In this context of mutual survival, the next section of this episode is international law and the responsibility to protect. Another step forward in the legalisation of international humanitarian interventions was the recommendation in 2001 in the report of the International Commission on Intervention and State Sovereignty, ICIS, what a mouthful, excuse the pun, for the international community to adopt the so-called responsibility to protect, also known as R2P, which kind of sounds a bit like a Star Wars character. The report describes its central theme as being, in quotes, the idea that sovereign states have a responsibility to protect their own citizens from avoidable catastrophe, from mass murder and rape, from starvation, but that when they are unwilling to do so, that responsibility must be borne by the broader community of states. The report declared, "We want no more Rwandas," referencing the genocide in 1994, when in just 100 days in 1994, some 800,000 people were slaughtered by Hutu extremists, hacked and burnt to death. 800,000 people. The problem is that the Commission, co-chaired by Australia's former Attorney General and Foreign Affairs Minister Gareth Evans, preferred that the UN Security Council, that is the very body which failed to prevent genocide in Rwanda in 1994, as well as in other nations, especially during the Cold War, this failed body should maintain its monopoly on authorising interventions to protect victims of extreme suffering and crimes when their own governments failed to protect them, or if it was in fact those governments that were doing the persecuting. Incidentally, I once saw Gareth Evans in a hotel in Adelaide and thanked him personally for his role when he was a member of the Hawke government in the 1980s in welcoming refugees from Iran into Australia, fleeing persecution by the government of the Islamic Republic of Iran. I told him that although I was born in Australia, this move to open the doors to hard-working, capable Iranian refugees had changed my life. I told him that I had cherished making many Iranian friends in Australia, that my daughter Nava, who was standing next to me and was about 5 at the time, was born because her mother was one of the Iranians who had been given a new life in Australia. Now, incidentally, Nava is herself studying postgraduate law at the University of New South Wales in Sydney. But back to the commission chaired by Gareth Evans. The synopsis of its report on the responsibility to protect states at paragraph 3A, there is no better or more appropriate body than the United Nations Security Council to authorise military intervention for human protection purposes. Sorry to sound like a lawyer here, but to quote another paragraph from the report, paragraph 3E allows for alternative action by the UN General Assembly or regional organisations when the Security Council fails to act. So that sounds good. We're not necessarily stuck with the Security Council when it's paralysed. But then they add this potentially unrealistic proviso, subject to their seeking subsequent authorisation from the Security Council. In other words, the General Assembly or some regional body then need to go back to the Security Council to ask for their approval. It's debatable whether the Security Council would authorise action after the event when it failed to do so beforehand. However, in fairness to the Commission, it does state that its intention is not to find alternatives to the Security Council, generally speaking, as a source of authority, but to make the Council work better than it has. Accordingly, it suggests in paragraph 3E of the synopsis that the Security Council permanent members use their veto in a more responsible manner so as not to block justified humanitarian interventions. So, what has happened? This leads us to the next section. Where did it all go wrong? Sadly, the opposite to the recommendation for Security Council members to use their veto responsibly has happened. The opposite. With the Security Council again hopelessly divided and permanent members breaking international law by invading and threatening neighbours and even faraway nations. We can all think of examples of that, both in recent history and today. So it's been back to the future, back to the bad old days of pre-1989, back to Security Council paralysis, back to extreme dangerous nationalism, back to religious prejudice and terrorism. Given the track record of the Security Council to date, progress on the Security Council enforcing the responsibility to protect may, unless rapid reform occurs as a result of a currently unforeseen global shock, such as a major global or additional bloody regional war or a cataclysmic terrorist attack, unless these things happen, and of course hopefully they don't, without such a shock, progress will sadly most likely be painfully slow, because humanity seems to have a history of learning things the hard way rather than the easy way. The Security Council's inability to implement the responsibility to protect 7 years after its introduction was highlighted in relation to the Council's failure to intervene forcefully when the Burmese government refused adequate international assistance as its own people were dying of preventable diseases after Cyclone Nargis in May 2008. As Australian academic Professor Andrew O'Neill wrote, the reality is that despite its majestic responsibility to protect manifesto, there is no chance of the UN intervening to save ordinary Burmese from horrible suffering without their government first giving its consent. If intervention does not take place, we should be honest with ourselves and ditch any pretense that the responsibility to protect and the liberal humanitarian project mean anything beyond generating warm and fuzzy sensations for Western academics. Since then, of course, there's been a genocide in Burma against the Rohingya community, a matter litigated in the International Court of Justice in The Hague, and civil war with countless atrocities. Again, a personal diversion. Professor O'Neill was one of my teachers in a very small class when I completed my Masters in International Law and International Relations at Flinders University. He's now at Griffith University in Brisbane. By way of background for this podcast and this topic, I got my law degree from Adelaide University, my graduate diploma of legal practice from the University of South Australia, and my graduate diploma of international law from the Australian National University in Canberra. But back to, at the time, the revolutionary and promising concept of the responsibility to protect. Now, since the failure of the responsibility to protect being implemented by the Security Council in relation to Cyclone Nargis in Burma in 2008, there have been sadly multiple examples of UN impotence. For example, the so-called Western humanitarian intervention in Libya, leading to it becoming a failed state and haven for terrorists and slave traders. The multiple attacks on Israel on and after 7 October 2023, and the horrific but barely reported in Western media wars in the Congo, Yemen and Sudan. And these are just a snippet of the many conflicts. It's important to acknowledge reality and learn from it and improve on it, which opens the door to the next section of this podcast. That is the triumphs of international criminal tribunals. All of that talk about the failure of the Security Council can be a bit depressing, but wallowing in negativity achieves nothing. Those who can see history trending towards eventual embracing, at least in principle, of collective security can point to growing acceptance, at least in theory, of the responsibility to protect doctrine in the years since 2001. For example, the notion of the global responsibility to protect was accepted by the high-level panel on threats, challenges and change in its report, A More Secure World, Our Shared Responsibility. It was also accepted by the UN Secretary-General's 2005 report, Enlarger Freedom Towards Development, Security and Human Rights for All, and by the UN General Assembly itself in a resolution in 2005. Another cause for remaining positive has been the rise of international courts and tribunals, offering hope at least for a while. Legendary international lawyer and Judge Antonio Cassese and the other judges making up the appeals chamber of the ICTY, that is, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, were conscious of the historic advances in international law being made by a tribunal which are being established by a unified, temporarily, UN Security Council. This is what Judge Cassese said: "One cannot but rejoice at the thought that universal jurisdiction being nowadays acknowledged in the case of international crimes, a person suspected of such offences may finally be brought before an international judicial body for a dispassionate consideration of his indictment by impartial, independent and disinterested judges coming, as it happens here, from all continents of the world." Dr. Grant Neiman, who served as a senior prosecutor at the ICTY before teaching international law at Flinders University, also lauded the Security Council for setting up the Tribunal for Yugoslavia. This is what he said: "I am firmly of the view that the creation of the ICTY was one of the most important measures adopted by the Security Council in the history of the UN." Again, a minor personal connection and diversion. Dr. Neiman was a member of the Australian Commonwealth Director of Public Prosecutions, DPP, team which prosecuted Ivan Poliakovich over war crimes allegedly committed decades before during World War II. At that time, I'd taken one of my breaks from practicing law to work as a journalist with Adelaide's metropolitan daily newspaper, The Advertiser, and was working as a court reporter covering Poliakovich's trial. The world's media descended on Adelaide for the trial, including Time magazine. The jury quickly acquitted Poliakovich and the world media moved on. But the Commonwealth DPP did the best they could, given the alleged crimes that happened decades before, and as a result, much of the evidence had been excluded by the trial judge during a voir dire, so the jury never heard it. Later, Dr. Neiman was one of my teachers in my Masters. He was not only uniquely qualified to teach international law, but a genuinely kind, humble man, a great role model for other academics to aspire to. The International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia was fortunate to have prosecutors from around the world of the calibre of Grant Neiman. So that's a mouthful, I'll stick to ICTY. It's encouraging that the ICTY and other tribunals, for example for the crimes in Rwanda and other places internationally, that they didn't limit prosecutions to lowly military officers alone. The ICTY statute specifically states the official position of any accused person, whether as head of state or government or as a responsible government official, shall not relieve such person of criminal responsibility nor mitigate punishment. This is an example of the global push after the fall of the Berlin Wall to hold leaders to account for their crimes. And in truth, it was following the precedent of the Nuremberg trials, which we'll get to later, after World War II. Leaders from the former Yugoslavia and other nations have been tried by national and international tribunals. As Patricia Wald stated in Tyrants on Trial in 2009, this is what she said, "In the past decade, we have seen several heads of state, as well as military and civilian leaders, criminally tried under international law for actions taken in their leadership capacities. They include Slobodan Milosevic, former president of the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, Charles Taylor, former president of Liberia, Saddam Hussein, former president of Iraq, Jean Kambanda, former prime minister of Rwanda, Theonest Bagosora, former Rwandan colonel, and Radovan Karadzic, former Bosnian Serb leader." Another leader ultimately held accountable for mass murder was the butcher of Srebrenica, Bosnian Serb General Ratko Mladic. I watched part of his trial in The Hague in 2014 and saw him sitting there looking smug, arrogant, contemptuous, combative and unrepentant. But 11 years later, he's still behind bars, where he deserves to be. The fact that leaders have been held to account offers hope for victims of all international crimes. Leaders have been targeted for their war crimes and crimes against humanity, despite the inherent logistical and political challenges involved. These challenges include the extremely large volume of documents involved in proving that specific atrocities could be linked via the chain of command all the way up to political leaders. In the case of Milosevic, this included 1.2 million pages of prosecution evidence. Imagine having to read all that. A bit of light reading for the poor lawyers and judges. 1.2 million pages. In view of this statistic alone, the following statement by Dr. Grant Neiman about the significance and scale of the ICTY prosecutions is unarguable. He said that prosecutors undertook the largest criminal investigation ever attempted in history. Something to celebrate. The excellent work of the ICTY, which remember stands for the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, try saying that quickly. Anyway, it's excellent work in limiting impunity for international crimes. Continued for many years. For example, the ICTY sentenced 2 senior Bosnian Serb officers, Vujadin Popovic and Ljubica Bera, to life in jail for their part in the 1995 Srebrenica massacre of 8,000 men and boys. The 30th anniversary of this tragic day was held on July 11, 2025. Australian ICTY prosecutor Graham Blewett celebrated the convictions at the ICTY by declaring the fact that there is now a capacity to investigate them, to indict them, to arrest them and to prosecute them should be a sufficient deterrent against genocide and crimes against humanity. Blewett used the opportunity also to highlight the importance of the creation of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, not to be confused with the International Cricket Council. Now, the ICC, like the ICTY before it, is seated in The Hague in the Netherlands. This is what Blewett said. "Now that there is a permanent International Criminal Court in existence in The Hague, I think that deterrent is there. And it must, in my view, play on the minds of people who are contemplating genocide or crimes against humanity as a means of implementing their political goal, that they are going to be held to account for it." No doubt, Slobodan Milosevic, the haughty, Machiavellian, ruthless and all-powerful leader of Serbia, thought he would get away with his war crimes. But he died behind bars in The Hague, the city appropriately named as a city of peace and justice. No doubt Hitler too, at the height of his power, thought he was untouchable. But he was defeated, and the surviving Nazi leaders were tried, convicted and punished in Nuremberg. Now, speaking of international criminal tribunals, I'm very much looking forward to the movie Nuremberg, with Russell Crowe playing the diabolical Hermann Goering and Rami Malek playing Douglas Kelly, the chief psychiatrist at Nuremberg prison. Malek was amazing as charismatic Queen frontman Freddie Mercury in Bohemian Rhapsody. I can't wait to see his performance in Nuremberg, chronicling the groundbreaking advances in international law made in these trials of some of history's worst monsters. But even better than punishment is prevention in the first place. This is what we touch on in the next topic, and that is collective security works. The UN was set up to use collective security to prevent and quickly end wars. That hope soon died as Stalin, the mass murderer and dictator of the former Soviet Union, occupied Central and Eastern Europe and stoked wars across the globe to spread communism. Although collective security was still born in a UN which was paralysed for decades by the Cold War, it lived on in the North Atlantic Treaty Organisation, NATO, where, to date, it has prevented a full-scale invasion of a NATO nation. And if such an invasion does happen, it will be because NATO has been weakened. But to date it hasn't. And this is because of the cornerstone of NATO, Article 5, establishing the principle of collective defence, collective security, where an attack on one member is an attack on all members. Collective security has worked for NATO nations since NATO was set up in April 1949. In other words, collective security is not just a nice idea. It has worked in practice, in reality, for 76 years in Europe, while wars have raged in countless other parts of the globe during this time and still do. Observers of current affairs will note that NATO has been tested recently, and there are isolationists who now question the existence of NATO. But whatever happens next for NATO, history will show. For the NATO members of Europe, which for centuries have been torn apart by religious, nationalist and imperial wars, history will show that NATO members were safe for a long time from invasion in Europe. But we can never rest on our oars, as we never know what will come next. For example, who can forget the shock of September 11, 2001? Anyone old enough to remember will never forget where we first heard the news on that dreadful day. Now, this day leads us to the next section. What happens when we give up on collective security and international tribunals? Just as 1989 was a turning point, so were the attacks by cruel, hate-filled religious fanatics on America on September 11, 2001. In an ideal world, collective security would have been the preferred response to the September 11, 2001 terrorist attacks on the US, with the UN leading action to disarm Al-Qaeda and arrest and try Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden and other Al-Qaeda criminals in an international court, as had in fact occurred with the criminals from the former Yugoslavia just a few years before September 11. So it's not some impossible dream. It happened not long before September 11. But American academic Philip Bobbitt points out the obvious: that is not the world in which we live. We know what happened. There was a so-called global war on terror, with shameful use of torture and renditions, that is, kidnapping suspected terrorists and flying them to places where they could be tortured with impunity. And bin Laden was eventually shot and killed in Pakistan and buried at sea. Sadly, the world we live in saw 20 years of war in Afghanistan, which ended in the Western Allies losing and leading to the Taliban's return to power. It could have been different. The shock of the September 11 attacks could have been a catalyst for moving closer to a world of enforcing collective security. The world originally foreseen by the founders of the UN. As James Traub wrote, FDR, that is World War II President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR and his aides had imagined the UN as a global police force, squashing conflict before it blazed into war. The dream flickered out in the first days of the Cold War. Now, cynical, defeatist adherents of the so-called realist school of international relations might dismiss the suggestion of international police action as a response to the September 11 attacks as being utopian. But what is the alternative in the age of weapons of mass destruction? Endless wars? Trillions of dollars wasted on weapons? instead of health, housing and education. And maybe one day those WMDs used again as they were in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There is a better way than endless war, and it's here that we move into the next section, learning from Gorbachev and Reagan. It's timely to revisit how the Soviet Union's last leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, and US President Ronald Reagan made peace after realising that the danger of a nuclear Armageddon was hanging by a thread, like the sword of Damocles above the heads of humanity. This is what Gorbachev wrote in his famous book Perestroika. The nations of the world resemble today a pack of mountaineers tied together by a climbing rope. They can either climb on together to the mountain peak or fall together into an abyss. After the great progress made for a while, after the end of the Cold War, humanity has tragically forgotten past lessons and returned to the dangerous doctrines of extreme nationalism and religious fundamentalism and hatred of the other, leading inevitably to incredibly dangerous wars, including threats in the last couple of years of the use of nuclear weapons. These threats have been even made in Europe, where after 2 ruinous world wars which killed millions, political leaders should remember history and avoid repeating the mistakes of their grandparents. Accordingly, we all have to learn from history and cannot give up on the goal of the founders of the UN, no matter how flawed it is now. Progress in other once seemingly impossible dreams, such as ending legally entrenched racism in the US in the 1960s, offers hope that advances can also be made in dealing with international crimes and aggression. This could and should be through collective security, rather than the primitive and barbaric approach of nations waging war against each other, sending missiles and drones, deliberately targeting and maiming and killing civilians, mass murder. It does not have to be that way. As we will see in the next section, there are alternatives. The next section is why we can establish peace. Progress in other complex areas of conflict offers hope. As Michael Ignatieff wrote, the civil rights movement in the United States was one long struggle against manipulated apathy and concerted racist resistance by a handful of activists. Only in retrospect does their victory seem inevitable. At the time, it often seemed a hopeless cause. In the early 1960s, African Americans in racist southern states couldn't vote. They had to sit at the back of the bus. They had to use separate toilets. They were lynched by vicious white racists. But by 2008, America elected its first African American president, Barack Obama. Now, this is not the forum for debating his policies, but the very fact that an African American was nominated and elected a few short decades after seemingly permanently entrenched southern segregation shows that old prejudices can be overcome. So we shouldn't despair. Change has happened and can and must happen in the great field of war and peace. Also, don't forget that despite its many undoubted flaws, the UN does exist. For centuries, the very existence of a body like the UN appeared to be a utopian dream. Now, it's far from perfect and it needs a lot of improvement, but it took centuries for Parliament to grow and evolve in the UK and other places. If the UN Security Council could be created, survive the paralysis of the Cold War, and set up effective international criminal tribunals to try war criminals in places diverse as the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, the UN is clearly capable of growing and improving over time, and it needs to, and we must demand that it does. Now, as I said before, and to stress the point, the alternative is endless wars, and one day, even by accident, a war with weapons of mass destruction. Maybe we've become too complacent and smug because nuclear weapons haven't been used since they were dropped on Japan at the end of World War II. But there have been very close calls, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 and in 1983 as well, when there was a lot of paranoia on both sides. So we can't just relax and assume it's never going to happen, because it hasn't happened for a long time. Sooner or later, our luck will run out and these weapons will be used, unless we rapidly reverse course and return to the hope and progress of 1989. Now, I'd like to emphasise that the international police force, which the UN envisaged after the calamity of World War II, with the Holocaust and 60 million war dead, this police force would not be anything like the model offered by the often militarily impotent UN peacekeepers, who have previously not been effectively empowered to enforce the writ of the UN. Prior to the September 11 attacks, UK academic Professor Mary Calder contrasted the failure of peacekeepers in the conflict in Bosnia with the more muscular international police force she envisaged. What was needed, in effect, was not peacekeeping, but humanitarian law enforcement. If the emphasis on international enforcement is a concern, given the shortcomings of the UN, then instead of condemning humanity to endless wars, we need to explore the next topic of this episode, and that is reforming the UN. If enforcing international law is to be led by the UN, it would first need to undergo radical surgery to root out its corruption and the hypocrisy of some of the world's worst human rights abusing nations, leading UN human rights bodies. Also, it's time to make it democratic at last. We should all be able to vote for who represents us at the UN, and it's long overdue to abolish the anachronistic veto power held by the permanent members of the Security Council, the so-called P5. That is the US, Russia, China, the UK and France. The P5 veto means that even if every other member of the Security Council votes for something, just one of the P5 members can veto it, poking a stick in the spokes of the wheel of peace and justice. This is an 80-year-old relic from the end of World War II. As the courageous late Czech President Václav Havel said, it was time to reconsider whether it is still appropriate, even hypothetically, that in the Security Council one country can outvote the rest of the world. Mary Calder's mooted reform, which she describes as an ambitious proposal to create a new kind of soldier-cum-policeman, is appealing because it avoids the weakness inherent in toothless versions of law enforcement, while still not being as extreme, deadly and destabilising as the world's remaining superpowers waging wars, killing and maiming hundreds of thousands of people. And it's happening right now. We need only turn on the TV at night to find daily examples of this sad reality. It's clearly not working. We have to try something different. Unfortunately, previous attempts at setting up a true international police military force have foundered on the rocks of that insidious disease, nationalism, that cancer on the world which is daily killing and maiming innocent children. After the Rwandan genocide, the late British politician Brian Urquhart proposed a standing UN army, trained, coordinated and located in select bases to respond to a new Security Council mandate. As Paul Kennedy highlighted, sadly, this was screamed down as yet another insidious effort by the world body to become a sovereign state itself. He said clearly those critics were ignorant of the original ideas for UN bases. But then ignorance was rife at this time. Finally, on the note of giving collective security a go at the global level, after it's kept the peace in Europe for decades, let's wrap up this discussion. Given the current hostility of the world's military superpowers to the UN, the International Court of Justice, the International Criminal Court, and to international law and multilateral institutions generally, and they are flawed and need reforming, as we've explored today. But given this hostility, it is tempting to be sceptical about the prospects for rekindling the flame of flourishing enforceable international law. However, let's not be sceptical. When we take a step back and survey the progress made to date, the increasing and irreversible interdependence of nations and peoples is plain to see. This is what Paul Kennedy said in his excellent book, The Parliament of Man. In the course of the 20th century, there occurred a development unique in the story of humankind. States which had defined themselves by their claims to sovereign independence gradually came together to create international organisations, to promote peace, curb aggression, regulate diplomatic affairs, devise an international code of law, encourage social development and foster prosperity. The emergence of this network of forms of global governance involved many setbacks and aroused much resistance. For every voice favouring global cooperation, there was another, warning against the erosion of national sovereignty. The debate is just as heated today. Nevertheless, were a diplomat or editor of the year 1900 to be transported to our present world, he or she would be astonished at the role that international bodies play on behalf of society. At the domestic level of, for example, Australia, where I live, there are multiple examples of progress. For example, in the 1960s, Australia brought shame on itself by the racist White Australia policy, banning non-white migrants. Also by stealing First Nations children from their mothers, by suppressing Indigenous languages, not even counting First Nations people as citizens, and legally paying women less for doing exactly the same work as men. Migrants from places like Italy and Greece face daily prejudice. All of this has changed dramatically. There's still a long way to go in eradicating injustice in Australia, just as there is in any other nation. But there is also enormous progress to celebrate. Let's build on that progress, both within nations like the US and Australia and internationally, and spurred on by the need for urgent action before it's too late. Finally, belatedly, establish a generation of peace. Let it be this generation.